The gymnasium in Hartwell County had never been this full for a co-op meeting. Folding chairs lined the walls 3 rows deep, and outside, trucks were parked clear down the block. At the front, the agricultural extension officer adjusted his microphone and called the room to order, though nobody was listening to him. They were all looking at the woman seated quietly near the back, hands folded in her lap, wearing the same plain wool coat she'd worn for a decade. By the end of that meeting, 3 of the county's wealthiest orchard families would sign contracts to buy fruit from her at a price they'd scoffed at 5 years earlier. The room had gone dead silent when the numbers were read aloud. Her yield per acre, her profit margin, her buyer list that now stretched from regional grocers to a specialty market 2 states over. Men who once called her hillside, a tax write-off with trees on it, stared at their boots. How had a woman with no machinery, no savings, and 40 acres everyone considered worthless built something the wealthiest farmers in the county couldn't touch? It hadn't started in that gymnasium. It hadn't even started with apples. If you enjoy stories about ordinary people who turn what others throw away into something extraordinary, consider subscribing. These stories deserve to be remembered. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far this community reaches. It started 11 years earlier, in 1977, the spring Margaret Ellery married into the Pruitt family. The Pruitt name meant something in that county. 3 generations of commercial orchard men, known for tidy rows, modern sprayers, and a produce stand that did brisk business every September. Margaret's husband, Daniel, was the quiet one of the family, more comfortable walking the rows at dusk than negotiating contracts in town. Margaret learned the orchard at his side, not because anyone taught her, but because she watched. She noticed which trees the bees favored. She noticed the old, gnarled rootstock near the property line that her father-in-law, Walter Pruitt, wanted bulldozed every single year and somehow never got around to. Walter and his wife were not cruel people. They were proud people, the kind who measured a farm's worth in acreage and equipment, not in soil. They tolerated Margaret as a daughter-in-law who worked hard and didn't complain, which in their world was a high compliment. Daniel died suddenly in the winter of 1981, a tractor accident on an icy slope, the kind of accident every orchard family fears and few escape forever. Margaret was 34, with 2 children and a grief she had no time to sit with, because within months, the family's lawyers were at her kitchen table. The commercial orchard, the modern equipment, the produce stand contracts, and the family's savings account had all been held in Walter's name, or in partnerships that excluded Daniel's widow by careful design. It was legal, airtight, and devastating. What Margaret was left with was the back 40, the rocky hillside parcel nobody wanted, an old irrigation pond half choked with cattails, and roughly 200 heirloom apple trees that had been ignored for 30 years, scattered and untended, the kind of trees that produced small, odd-shaped, deeply flavored fruit nobody in 1981 thought was worth picking. "That land never made a dime," Walter told her, not unkindly, the day the papers were signed. "You take it, and I won't feel guilty about the rest." He believed he was being generous. For 2 years, Margaret made mistakes. She tried to graft scion wood onto rootstock with no real technique and lost half her cuttings the first spring. She overpruned a row of old, wealthy apples and stunted them for 2 seasons. She spent a summer hauling water to trees that, she'd later learn, needed almost no irrigation at all once their root systems were properly encouraged, downward, instead of kept shallow by careless watering. But she watched. She kept notebooks. She drove 40 minutes to the state extension office and asked questions nobody else in her family had ever bothered to ask. She learned that heirloom varieties, the gnarled, worthless trees Walter wanted gone, carried genetics modern orchards had stripped out for the sake of uniform, shippable fruit. Disease resistance, drought tolerance, flavor complexity that commanded premium prices from chefs and specialty buyers who'd grown tired of flavorless supermarket apples. She learned to read her soil instead of fighting it. She built compost from orchard waste instead of buying synthetic fertilizer. She let clover and vetch grow between her rows instead of bare dirt, and watched as earthworm activity and beneficial insects multiplied, season over season. The old irrigation pond, once dismissed as a liability, became a reservoir that recharged her water table and supported a wetland edge thick with pollinators. She studied pruning not as a chore, but as a conversation with each tree, opening the canopy to let light reach inner branches, which improved fruit quality and reduced the fungal pressure that thrived in dense, shaded growth. She learned which native wasps and ladybugs kept aphids in check without a single spray, and which neighboring plants drew those insects in on their own. None of it happened quickly. Some seasons brought barely any visible change at all, just slightly healthier bark, slightly fuller blossoms, slightly deeper color in the leaves, the kind of progress only someone paying very close attention would notice. While Margaret rebuilt slowly and in cash, the Pruitt family expanded. Walter took out loans for new spraying equipment and a second produce stand. He pushed for greater yield through heavier chemical inputs, and for a few years, it worked. Bigger harvests, bigger trucks, bigger talk at the co-op meetings. Margaret sold what little fruit she had at farmers' markets, priced modestly, debt-free. Then came 1985, 3 dry summers in a row, the worst regional drought in 2 decades. The Pruitt orchard, with its shallow-rooted, heavily irrigated modern trees, struggled badly. Irrigation costs soared. Fungal disease crept into stressed trees weakened by years of synthetic dependence. Walter borrowed more to compensate. Margaret's hillside, by contrast, barely faltered. Her trees' deep root systems, developed through years of disciplined, infrequent watering, reached groundwater the Pruitt orchard's shallow roots never touched. Her soil held moisture the bare dirt rows down the road simply couldn't retain. Her diverse, older varieties shrugged off disease pressure that devastated single-variety modern blocks. That was the year buyers first started asking about the Ellery apples. A regional grocer's produce manager drove out personally after a chef in the city raved about flavor he hadn't tasted since childhood. By 1987, Margaret was supplying 3 specialty markets and turning away requests she didn't have fruit to fill. The extension office began bringing visiting agronomy students to walk her rows. Neighboring farmers, some of the very families who'd once pitied her, started asking, quietly, almost embarrassed, how she'd done it. Walter Pruitt was one of them. He came to her kitchen table again in late 1987, not with lawyers this time, just a man in his 70s looking at a woman who'd built something lasting out of land he'd thrown away in contempt. He didn't apologize, not exactly. Pride doesn't unwind that easily. But he asked, plainly, what she'd done differently. Margaret told him. All of it. There was no triumph in her voice, only the patience of someone who'd learned that teaching cost nothing, and pride had cost him plenty. By that meeting in the Hartwell County Gymnasium in 1988, Margaret wasn't interested in being vindicated. She'd already used part of her earnings to quietly buy back 15 acres of the original orchard at a county auction, land the bank had repossessed from a struggling neighbor, not from the Pruitts, but close enough that everyone understood the symbolism. She didn't need anyone humiliated. The numbers on that overhead projector did the talking, and the silence in that room said the rest. What Margaret Ellery proved, slowly and without a single dramatic gesture, was that the value of land has very little to do with what it looks like the day you inherit it, and everything to do with what you're willing to learn from it over time. The wealthiest farmers in that county hadn't lost to a stroke of luck. They'd lost to patience, to observation, to a woman who treated 30 years of neglect not as a tragedy, but as an inheritance only she knew how to read. Sometimes the most valuable thing you'll ever own is the thing everyone else has already decided is worthless.